Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can check out the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify, Good Pods, basically any podcasting platform you want to go to, click subscribe, rate, and review. That always is a big benefit, especially as there are a lot of really great movie podcasts out there, and there are a lot, and you're going to get to hear some of those podcasters this summer. It's going to be a really fun run of episodes starting with today, and I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, make sure to click subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will get exclusive series like Leaving the Collection and Life Soundtrack, as well as early access reviews, some reviews that are basically exclusively for Patreon subscribers, as well as other content from film festivals, Dragon Con, as well as my annual Oscar nominations discussions, and that is at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Today's guest, it's been a while since he's been on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to having him back. We've talked about Martin Scorsese. We've talked about Andrei Tarkovsky. We've talked about Francois Truffaut, as well as a bunch of other films. We are going to be talking about another filmmaker with a pretty significant footprint in film history, and that is the independent maverick John Cassavetes. And join me is a filmmaker and now film critic, Chris Esper. Chris, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Brian. As always, like you said, it's been ages. Interesting that we're even talking about Cassavetes because in watching his films, and of course, we'll get into the discussion deeper. But in watching his films, I couldn't help but think of course, Scorsese because Cassavetes was a huge influence on him, but also Truffaut. And it's interesting because Truffaut and Cassavetes were sort of coming up at the same time, making films around the same period. So it's kind of interesting to see sort of the Americanized, if you will, sort of cinema verite style that the Fresh New Wave sort of adopted before that whole, I guess, free-flowing style came to America. So it's nice to see the other side of that around the same period and how that eventually changed the course of filmmaking for other independent filmmakers like Scorsese's or Woody Allen or Robert Altman even has said to be very influenced by Cassavetes. But we're getting ahead of myself here.
Oh yeah, but I mean, honestly, I mean, there's so many, I mean, you mentioning Truffaut and Scorsese. I mean, you can't really have a discussion about Cassavetes without discussing those two. I don't think, especially if you're well versed in their histories, and then if you're starting to get sense of Cassavetes as well. Before we do get into that deeper discussion, though, it has been a while since we've talked. So what have you been up to in the past few years?
So in the past few years, it's been a lot of interesting developments. So for one, I'm still making a lot of short films, but the latest one that you saw that now in festivals, it's sort of ending its run. It's not quite there yet, but it's still a few more to go. Undertaker, that one. And again, with that one, I was very much influenced by French New Wave cinema in making that picture. So kind of nice that we're going back to this similar sort of discussion. But yeah, so that one's making its rounds with the festival circuit. Done fairly well, I would say. I mean, very different film from most of the ones I've made, but I'm very, very pleased with it. Otherwise, I've been also working as a director of photography and editor on local productions here in New England, where I'm based. Sometimes travel to New York or wherever, it depends on the project. So I've been doing a lot of that. And as well, my day job is working as an assistant editor in reality television, primarily for A&E networks, but I've also done work for Irwin Entertainment on a few comedy specials that they've done for Netflix and for HBO Max. Well, excuse me, Max as it's called now. But
It will
but
always be HBO Max to me. I'm sorry.
yeah, same. I'm sorry. It will be next to me, but yes, I've done a few specials for them working as a assistant editor. So that's sort of been my bread and butter. That pays my bills, but it's also my field, which really helps to have a job in the field while also sort of working at your craft, if you will. So it's taught me a lot. It's helped me grow as a, I guess, creator, filmmaker. And now I've just been writing a lot, whether that's you mentioned being a film critic. I've been doing some reviews for Film Threat. It's been a while, but I need to sort of get back on that. But I started writing for them, as well as working on my own personal screenplays or other short form books. I just love to create. That's my. I just love to create as much as I can,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've always appreciated about you is the fact that you are willing to take up different challenges and different ways in order to hone your craft. I mean, I do think to a certain extent film criticism is just as, interesting a way of doing that as anything, especially for somebody who
Yeah.
is a filmmaker and is interesting. And I mean, we talked about Truffaut earlier. I mean, he started off as a film critic before he became a
Exactly.
filmmaker. All of the French New Wave did.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. It's
yeah.
funny you say that. It's funny you say that because that was actually my influence for even wanting to do it in the first place. Was I don't know. I was on kind of a. It's so weird. This is like back in January. I got on kind of I rewatched Life Itself for like the Up Team Times. I love that documentary. It's
Yeah.
fantastic about the great Roger Ebert, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that sent me down a rabbit hole of watching Siskel and Ebert all over again and marathoning all their shows. And I mean, they were just so intelligent and they were so smart and they were just so passionate
Mm-hmm.
about talking films and writing about films and rereading their essays and things like that, that it sort of influenced me to try that path a little bit and be like, okay, well, what because it's funny, I try to keep up with film criticism. I don't really as much as I used to, but it's fascinating how much has changed over the course of time with the advent of social media and Rotten Tomatoes and that sort of thing, where and there's very few good writers out there that really know how to write about film and do it in a personal way, the same way Roger Ebert did. I always felt like that was sort of missing with
Mm-hmm.
some of the reviews I would read. So I kind of want to take a stab at it too. And I've been mostly reviewing independent films, much like you do, like whatever submissions come in through their website. But it's been fun because you discover these new people that you never heard of before. You discover very fascinating films, and sometimes the films you don't love so much, but you still appreciate what they did, especially newer filmmakers. I reviewed a few films from some newer filmmakers, and I couldn't really fault them if there was like something wrong technically with audio or with lighting or what have you, because I was there too. And you're sort of learning, and I almost appreciated them that I could hardly really even give them bad reviews, but just, sort of say something to the extent of, there's a learning curve here. I didn't quite love the film, but I could appreciate what was going on
Mm-hmm.
here.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's fun. It's a lot of fun to discover new voices and what they have to say, what they have to offer.
Well, welcome to that life of being a film critic. I mean, that's honestly, in all honesty, I mean, one of the best things that ever happened to me as a film critic was not only getting to be familiar with your work, but other people that
Sure.
we know, other filmmakers that you and I are both associated
Mhm.
with, and
Yep.
to really, and I mean, I certainly understand what you mean as far as trying not to fault people, especially with technical imperfections, especially if you're working on that lower scale of independent cinema where it's like
Mhm.
you're limited by the means that you have. And so
Exactly.
I mean, so long as, and for me, so much of it is so long as the story you're telling is sound and I get engaged by it, I can look over those and I can look past those imperfections because of the fact that it's like you can tell that the filmmaker's learning, but you can also tell that they're good at telling a story.
Exactly. And that was sort of the basis of my thoughts with again, not to jump ahead, but like in watching Shadows, for example. This was my first time seeing it, by the way. I had not seen Shadows prior to
Mm-hmm.
this podcast. And in watching it, I knew it was Cassavetes' first film, and I knew it was held in such high regard, and it's often held on a very high pedestal. And I could see exactly why. It's a terrific film, but all the same, I did see the technical stuff as well that were exactly what we're talking about, and it was made with very little money, shot on 60 millimeter film with like a borrowed camera. Uh, Hardly ever using a boom pole. They used body mics for most of it, and
Yeah.
probably had to dub. They had to dub 90% of the sound. I shouldn't say 90%. They had to dub a lot of the sound, I should say, due to the fact that there was no way of syncing the picture with the sound because there was no one keeping track of takes. I did all this research online. I was like, wow, it's like flashback for myself who was starting out like 10, 13 years ago or so. And so in a way I couldn't even like really criticize it because it was actually charming to see this sort of like DIY approach to filmmaking that he was taking with this first film.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really it's kind of important to realize that even somebody like Cassavetes, who is considered one of the godfathers of modern independent cinema,
Right.
he's not working with Hollywood on these films. He's doing his
Oh,
own. I mean, even on the third film that we're talking about, Woman Under the Influence, he had to mortgage his
right.
house in order to
Oh
get
yeah.
some of the budget. So, I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
he's working, and I think a big part of that is the way he's working and the types of stories he's telling. And we can actually go ahead and jump into Cassavetes, and let's start
Sure.
with what was it? Because I asked you if there was a particular subject that you wanted to
Right.
cover on your return to Sonic Cinema podcast. What was it
Mhm.
about Cassavetes that made you want to pick him?
Well, in all honesty, again, it was an excuse to actually go and actually see his films because I've read about him. I've heard other filmmakers talk about him. I've seen bits and pieces of his films, but never actually seen them all in full. And
Mm-hmm.
I watched documentaries about him, and I just thought, wow, what a fascinating figure. I got to know more. So when you reached out to me, I figured, oh, this is the perfect time. I figured you'd be on board too, given your love of independent cinema as well. So I thought, okay, this will be a nice sort of bridge because again, we covered Scorsese with his sort of biblical trilogy. We've covered Truffaut with his most, I guess, influential works. Again, Tarkovsky, and so it just seemed appropriate to go on the other side of the spectrum and try Cassavetes. And again, I just really wanted to see what I don't want to say what the fuss was about because that's not the right term, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like I want to see what the praise was coming from, and I really just wanted to put the two together. And I was influenced by him, sort of in a distance, so now I wanted to see full front like fully like what his films were like from beginning to end,
Mm-hmm.
and I was not disappointed at all.
Oh no, neither was I. I mean, even Shadows, which was the earliest film of his, which was
Mhm.
his first film, though
Sure.
also was the earliest film of his that we decided we were going to look
Hmm.
at. I mean,
Hmm.
even I don't know that I love it as much as you do. I do think it kind of meanders as much a bit, and I think a
Yeah.
big part of that is the improvising
Yeah.
that takes place in terms of
Hmm.
building the scenes. But
Yeah.
even in that movie, you can tell by the way he uses the music and the camera, it's a very distinctive look. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's not necessarily distinctive to us in 2023, but
No.
you can tell that it was as revolutionary as what Godard and
Right.
Truffaut were doing over in France.
Oh, exactly. I mean, and I don't think I don't think Shadows is by far. I mean, he considers it his best film, Cassavetes. I actually thought of the three that we viewed, I thought Woman Under the Influence was the best one, which we'll get
Yeah,
to
we'll get
a
to
little bit
that.
more.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Shadows, I appreciated it, but I agree with you to some extent that it did meander quite a bit, and some of the acting was not always there a lot of the time, and you could tell that they were volunteers, they were amateur actors, and that was Cassavetes' full intent was to do real people, with hardly even a written script, just simply a very detailed outline, and then the actors would just improvise it. And a lot of times that worked. Other times, I don't think it worked really that well. And there were problems with like camera focus or with sound. And again, I couldn't fault that. I actually appreciated
Yeah.
that it had those, because it did have a very sort of cinema verite documentary style. And I watched it with my girlfriend, who used to be an editor, and she also loves old cinema too. So we watched it together, and she felt the same that you did too. That it kind of meandered a bit, but she appreciated what it was trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very episodic. I mean, it's basically, it feels like it's basically more trying to capture a moment than to tell a story. I mean, there
Yeah,
is a story that comes in when it comes to
yeah, yeah.
Layla and Tony,
Sure.
who's a mixed race couple, but he doesn't
Yeah.
realize that she's black. I
Right.
mean, she's passing, but and then when that realization comes up, I think the tension there's very palpable and you can feel that. But at the same time, it's just there's so many things about and for the most part, episodic is not necessarily a bad thing. Like
Mm.
episodic, you can create stories and themes and ideas in that, but it's really especially, and I think part of it is because of the fact that we're so conditioned to expect a narrative. Like we're supposed to, like the characters we meet in the beginning of the film are the characters we're going to be following throughout that entire film.
Right. Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
mean, it's like
Exactly.
you can kind of see this as sort of, you can kind of see the way that Linklater is a great example of somebody who was probably very inspired by Shadow.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, funny you should bring him up, because as soon as you said that, I thought of well, Boyhood is sort of an example of that. You could sort of see that sort of I guess not necessarily improv, but the idea of like episodic,
Yeah.
because because Boyhood is very episodic in the way it's told, going from age to age. I sort of see that here too. Like you said, there is sort of a plot, but it comes much later
Hmm.
into the story. But in between, there are some beautiful scenes. In particular, I like the scene where Tony and Layla are laying in bed after they had just made love, and they have that beautiful, beautiful dialogue scene. I have to wonder if that was at all written or if that was all improvised, because there were moments where I could tell it was improvisation. Then there were others where I was like, was that written? Was that
Yeah.
improv? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely do get that thing, but the thing I like about Shadows is that you can tell that it's Cassavetes really like figuring out what the film is, what
Right.
the medium of film can afford him, what type of
Right.
things that he can do in film and as a
Mhm.
filmmaker. And like I said, some of the uses of music, which it's from the 1950s and it's
Yeah.
jazz, it's blues, it's a lot of that stuff. It very much is of its time and place, but I think it's very
Yep.
effective in the way he uses music in that movie. But also the camera. I mean, it's funny because of the
Yes.
fact that even though I think the camera work is fantastic in all three of these films, that
Hmm.
one feels the most adventurous in the way that the
Yes.
camera is moving.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is just like, again, handheld camera work. Very little camera support by way of tripod or no crane shots. There's no like all the tools we know of today. They're just thrown out the window. Even the
Mhm.
tool. Well, the tool. I mean, and that's not to say that there weren't tools then. There certainly were of the time, but this was like, this was like not even a tripod, from what I could tell. It was mostly just handheld. That gave it a very intimate feel, I thought, and that's sort of been the theme of Cassavetes films is that intimacy. But it's interesting as we get to Woman Under an Influence. I noticed that the camera work was more locked down. It was more voyeuristic than intimate, and I think there's a reason for that,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
we'll get to. But no, here, I mean, he's with the actors. He's following them from room to room. From what I understand, the way Cassavetes would light a scene, or would instruct his cinematographer to light the scenes, is by just having a single light, just to light the whole room, not going for effect, not going for anything spectacular, just giving a basis for the camera to be able to capture the images, and I think that's great because then they'll have room for the actors to move around. Same with the sound. Again, they would just use body mics, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like you said that you brought up Cassavetes because of the fact that it was finally, it was an opportunity for you to start digging into his work. I mean, this is honestly the first time I've watched any of these films too. I thought I had seen Faces, the second film in our little trio here, before, but I could just be projecting the fact that I've seen the clips that are in Scorsese's documentary about American film so much that that's kind of what I'm thinking about when when I watch that. But so I mean this was all completely new to me. But like you said, I mean he's a filmmaker who's so important in the history of American cinema, and because of the fact that you and I started talking because I started watching your work, which is and very much the way I started to really appreciate independent film, not beyond the studio independent film, and basically film festivals. And as I've started to cover film festivals and stuff like that, I become more and more familiar with filmmakers working on limited means and basically trying to take what they can get as far as making their art. And I think that, and that's one of the things that is so extraordinary about Cassavetes. And it's kind of it's also kind of an indictment of the system too. The fact that even though he had this tremendous debut in Shadows, and then later he would have Faces, which is another huge success, relatively speaking, he was still having to do stuff like mortgage his house to get Woman Under the Influence made, which is absolutely wild.
It's wild, yeah. And then as we get to that film too, I mean, he was also in a position where he'd have a distributor. Really, he would just like bring cans of film from theater to theater to to be able to exhibit it. And a lot of theaters, distributors either didn't want his films, they didn't understand his films. He was also the kind of filmmaker that he would show a cut of a film, realize something didn't work, go back, re-edit it, and re-release. I think he did that with Shadows. I'm pretty sure. I know he did it with Faces, but I believe he also did that.
Yeah. I mean, I read up on both of them, and I mean, both of them were cases where there were longer cuts of them. I mean, Faces is already over 2 hours, so I mean, it's hard to imagine that being any, that working any longer. But at the same time, I mean, you're just basically watching him figure out the craft of film in Shadows. I mean, for the most part, I think he succeeds very well. And like I said, I think it's a very good film overall. I think it's an interesting film overall. It just didn't quite have the impact to me that Faces and Woman Under the Influence did. But I would agree with that. But you can still see the craft is there. You can still see the beginnings of what was to come with those later films.
Yeah. I think if anything, Shadows is probably so revered, not necessarily because of the story or not necessarily because of anything specific within the film, but more so of what happened behind the camera in getting it made, and also the intent behind it. And again, like you said, the evolution of a craftsman, of a filmmaker, developing his voice, I guess, if you will. I think that's why it's probably more influential, and not so much because of the film itself. And again, that doesn't mean it's a bad film. Far from it.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't say, like you said, say that like quite on the same level as Faces or Woman Under the Influence.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can go ahead and go to Faces. And the thing that even right away when I was watching this film, you could tell that everything about the filmmaking was just so much more pronounced and so much stronger than it was in Shadows. I mean, he made a couple of features in the interim, but he also did a lot of television. And I wonder what, as an editor and as a cinematographer as well as a filmmaker yourself, what is the you've talked about you're working on television a lot. What is the what is the fundamental difference in working on television shows
Mhm.
versus film?
That's a great question. So primarily I've been working in reality TV, which is a whole other beast than episodic television. And as we know, right now with the writer's strike, there's really not much happening with episodic TV at this time. But nonetheless, TV, whether it is reality television or whether it is episodic or I should say fictional television is very fast and furious. You have to get it done. Everyone wants it yesterday. the
Yeah.
Every cut that goes out to a network or what have you. So it's much quicker, it's much faster. And I did one of my many projects I've been working on the past couple years is compiling a list of interviews with different directors for this follow-up book I'm writing for Filmmaker's Journey, which I wrote in 2016. And I had spoken to a few television directors, one of whom was John Badham, who, of course,
Mm-hmm.
he's more known for his feature work, of course. Saturday Night Fever, Blue Thunder, War Games, but he also directs a lot of television and has before he became a feature director and still doing television today. And one of the things that he said that remains true is that television is shot in 7 to 8 days for the most part. And of course, on a feature film, you could sometimes have, of course, depending on the circumstances, you have more time and more money to work with versus in television. Although it's interesting though, with the advent of Netflix and the advent of Hulu and all this original streaming content, television is looking a lot more like movies
Yeah.
today. Or I should say, they are looking like movies, really. I mean, we've already made it to where television is just as cinematic as film is or should be. The turnaround time I think is still the same, where you have to get a show done really quickly. The only difference is now there's more money in television because back then in Cassavetes' time, even going up to the early 2000s, I would say television was looked down upon as like sort of like the redheaded stepchild
Oh yeah.
of the medium. Because only hack writers, I should say in quotes, wrote for TV. Hack directors only worked in TV, or if you were starting out, you weren't a real director. All of that. So it was sort of like bottom of the barrel, but now that's changed. But the difference, I'd say, is just really time. I mean, you have about a week to shoot a show. In the case of reality television, it's sort of continuous.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually do have scenes that we call verite scenes, where it's just a camera fly on the wall following the action. And a lot of that's adopted from people like Cassavetes, sort of the cinema verite filmmakers of that period, like Maisels. I forget who, I don't remember who did the Rolling Stones documentary, Gimme Shelter.
That was was that
Or was
not
that?
the Maisels?
Oh, yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, that is the
Yeah.
Maisels. But, like Pennebaker, like those guys who sort of created this sort of freeform filmmaking that has become pretty popular today. A lot of that came from that, and now we adopted to reality television. So really, film kind of influenced TV, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we are now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you brought up really TV really starting to kind of change in the 2000s. I do think that change did kind of start in the 90s because
Yeah.
you are right about the reputation of TV because even in the 80s it was still predominantly episodic in the sense that it was very familiar
Yes.
tropes and storytelling, whether it's sitcoms, whether it's more dramatic shows. They basically all worked within very established formulas from
Right.
the 50s onward. And then in the
Right.
90s, you get Twin Peaks, you get the X Files,
Sure.
and you get
Yeah.
series like that really do kind of start to push things forward stylistically.
Right.
And then by the time Sopranos comes out at the end of the decade, it's just off to the races. And once HBO starts taking over,
That's
I
true.
mean, it basically, you can't do the same thing on network TV anymore.
Mhm.
So,
No, that's a very good point. And you also think about too the way television was shot.
yeah.
Um, from like I guess sort of I guess by the 90s that did stop as well. Nowadays we have television that's in widescreen in 4K even.
Mhm.
But but before all that, television was shot 4:3, and really framing of shots. You had the characters in the middle of the frame, whereas in widescreen you have more space to work with. Where it's a much more interesting shot to have lead room for your actor to be sort of either left or right of frame. They have some lead room in front of them where they can look off to whatever they're looking at in the distance, and you cut to it. Of course, you have the widescreen format and letterbox and all of that, all the benefits that TV did not have until, like you said, 90s, 2000s, when it started to be taken a little bit more seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because of the fact that like the whole reason widescreen exists at all for films is because of the fact that the studios were trying to figure out a way to compete with TV and make sure that people were still coming to theaters.
Right.
Yeah. And so now that TV basically adopted widescreen in its own, and TVs started to adapt and get bigger and get more elaborate, especially with amorphic widescreen 16:9, 4K now, basically trying to get people. There's this tension of like, how do cinemas keep up with TV? And it's really, we're in that struggle right now because of the fact that, I mean, even it's not that the pandemic necessarily I mean, obviously it did cripple movie theaters for a huge degree. I mean, I'm very aware of that personally, but at the same time, it basically accelerated TV kind of taking over for movies. And especially as the streamers started to put out their own original films, it's like, oh, well, we'll just wait until it's streaming. And then and that's a huge crux of what's going on with the current writer's strike.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, pandemic aside, this would have happened no matter what. Pandemic, because I mean, we were already sort of getting there. The pandemic just elevated it because couldn't leave our house for a year or so or whatever. And it's a shame because I love going to the cinema, and to be able to see movies like Cassavetes films, let's say, or Scorsese, as we know, he's a big proponent of cinema viewing versus streaming, and I can appreciate that his latest film, Killers of the Moonflower, is going to be in theaters in addition to Apple TV, and I'm glad that streamers are giving opportunities like that for specific films or filmmakers, and hopefully that trend can still continue because there is something special about seeing in a theater and watching on a big screen, and it's interesting too that you mentioned, we can wait till it streams. That is sort of the equivalent of back when I was a kid. It was, we can wait till it comes out on video.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing that, as you and I were growing up, one of the things that made that a dicier prospect of just waiting for video is it wasn't necessarily it wasn't on a specific time frame of when movies would come out in video, because I mean, as VHS was coming into its own, it's like some big movies were not coming on video, and I mean, I think it took Spielberg 6 years to finally put E.T. on VHS.
That's right.
Even stuff like Jurassic Park though wouldn't even come out for a year, and so when the studios really figured out that VHS was a big business, and then they created DVD, Blu-ray, all of that stuff, once they realized the home market was something they could take advantage of financially, then they're like, oh, okay, so we need to start getting on a regular time frame for when some of these movies come out.
That's right.
And now it's like, some movies like Fast 9, I think, is coming out in VOD this week, and it just came out mid-May. Right. And it's like, well, I mean, that's kind of how it is, but
it's really crazy. Yeah. I mean, you could see a movie a movie comes out into the theater 3 or 4 weeks later, it's already on demand. It's like, wow. I mean, when Fabelmans came out, I had full intention to see it in theaters, and then like 3 or 4 weeks went by. It was gone from theaters. Then it went straight to Vudu, and I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going to see it on Vudu. That's how I saw it. That's how I saw it, unfortunately. But nonetheless. But it's sad because like that's kind of the treatment that Cassavetes films I think would receive today.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is, you wouldn't see films like these made today by a studio, at least not by Hollywood,
Oh no.
independently. Absolutely, but because of the fact that it is so heavy improvisation, and it's so intimate, personal, and largely no plot, you would not see a film like this made by a studio. There's no way.
No, I mean honestly, it's like you are right. It's like it's hard to imagine a mainstream audience getting to see a movie like Shadows or Faces. Period. I mean,
Yeah,
unless it's a huge hit at a film festival like Sundance,
yeah,
it's not necessarily going to get picked up by a studio. So they're not going to try to give it a platform release. And well, I mean, platform releases are barely even a thing anymore.
yeah.
But you just don't. You're right. You just don't have that market for this type of thing. And I mean, this is it's like Cassavetes' work. Unfortunately, is the type of stuff that you would see do the film festival circuit, and
Yep,
then you might find it on a streaming platform later. Well,
exactly.
depending on whatever deal comes into place, and
Yeah.
that is completely deflating.
Exactly. And we should also preface by saying we saw. I mean, at least I saw these films. I don't know about you. I saw these films on Max. Like these films are available.
Oh
Actually, a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
the majority of Cassavetes films are available on Max. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that. I didn't realize it had a home. I'm thinking I'm gonna have to buy the Blu-rays. I'm gonna have to search on Amazon Prime and rent for like $3.99 or
Right.
whatever for each. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that they're all available. So that's great that there's that a streaming platform like Max is, I guess, sort of promoting his films. I
Yeah.
wish that I wish it was more of a push to
Well,
let.
Max is interesting because of the fact that ever since that one came in, they've always had like
Yeah,
one of the deeper catalogs of older films, and I really appreciate that. A big part of
yeah,
that, I think, is that TCM brand that they were pushing as well, and that's
yeah.
kind of a part of it. I actually saw these on Criterion Channel, and
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true.
so
Yep.
yeah, I watched them all on Criterion Channel. But yes, like you said, they are on Max as well. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like there are some films that and there are some films I saw 40 years ago at the Atlanta Film Festival. I had no
Mhm.
idea if there's any distribution in America for them, period. And I
Yeah.
really love them. And it's
Hmm.
like there's some where it's like, oh, that's and like I said, you would find it on a streamer. It's like, oh, okay, that's on Tubi, or that happened to get on Prime. And as a filmmaker yourself, and we'll get back to Cassavetes, but
Yeah, no problem.
one of the things I love talking with you is that you're a filmmaker yourself, and
Hmm.
so you have had to deal with a lot of the same situations and circumstances regarding funding, regarding getting
Hmm.
things made, regarding distribution that
Hmm.
a filmmaker like Cassavetes had to deal with.
Hmm.
um what is the hardest thing about making a film? What is the hardest thing about getting a film seen now?
Oh, that's a that's a loaded one. Like, no, because really, there's so many variables to it. I mean, the hardest thing about getting a film seen is, I mean, festivals are a great tool. I love film festivals,
Hmm.
but they're difficult because you have the middleman of who, well, the judges really, who whether they accept or don't accept it, and that's very difficult because because every festival has a specific theme that they're looking to, I guess, sort of project, or they're looking to showcase, and which is totally fair. And every year you get different trends, and that's part of the problem. Is very often filmmakers, they're making what's in them and like what's inside them. They're not really
Yeah.
thinking about. They're not thinking about trends really. They're just thinking about what's within them. Um, and whether it happens to hit the right place, right time, that's pure luck, I think. And you know, and the thing about film festivals too is a lot of times you're going to get more no's than yeses, which very often new filmmakers don't realize a whole lot, and it can be discouraging, it can be very disheartening, but ultimately it's not always because of the quality of your work, but purely because of selection process. They may have selected a film with a very similar theme already, or the filmmaker is could probably live closer to the festival and they know they're going to attend, so they want them
Mm-hmm.
they want they want their film with the same theme to screen. That way they have a filmmaker that they could have for the Q&A. There are just so many factors to it. You know, specifically state festivals, they're going to favor the locals because, you know, they're local to the town and all, and that's totally understand that. So there's a lot of factors to it. So I think that's hard. And then as far as distribution goes, so I've only made short films so far in my career. I produced a feature. I've been involved in a few feature films. Never have I directed one though. But even with short films, it's very difficult to get distribution because the fact of the matter is, short films, there is nobody in short films.
Yeah.
There's just not, and there really is no audience for them other than film festivals. I mean, yes, there's Amazon Prime, which was accepting independent films, and they were actually hosting many short films from independent filmmakers, including my own, those of people I've known. But unfortunately, Amazon decided that they no longer wanted to host short films and independent films, and they took them down just 2 years ago. They took them down, and they're no longer accepting them, and it's very sad, really.
Mm-hmm.
And there are platforms like Shorts TV. There are other sort of similar short film platforms. The only problem is, where can you get those apps? You know, I think Roku hosts them, things like that. And again, it's just getting the awareness out there that these apps do exist where you can see short films outside of YouTube or Vimeo, and sharing your link on social media ad nauseum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's very hard. It's just finding someone to host your film. Uh, and it's especially difficult if you're sort of going against the grain and you're doing something that's a little bit different. So for any filmmaker that's listening, don't give up. Just keep using your voice. Don't try to appease to anything. Just use your own voice and just keep trugging along. I mean, I know it's such a cliche thing, but really it's true. That's the only way you're going to get out there, is if you just find that one person that's going to say yes. And that's ultimately what it comes down to, is find that one person that believes in your vision and believes in your film and wants to showcase it.
Yeah, and one of the things I would definitely say, I mean, you know me, I've covered the Atlanta Film Festival, I've covered Renegade
Yeah.
Film Festival, I've covered Sundance. You know, one of the and I've covered Fantasia Fest, and one of the things I would personally say, as a critic, as somebody who's attended a wide variety of film festivals in a wide variety of ways, just because it's not one of the big name film festivals does not mean it's not worth taking a chance on submitting your work there. I mean,
Hmm.
I've seen some fantastic short films at stuff like Renegade. I've seen some fantastic stuff at the Atlanta Film Festival, which is, you know, it's
Yeah.
not a small film festival, but like you said, it is kind of a local one. You get a lot of Georgia
Yes.
filmmakers here. But the thing is, I mean, some of my favorite films I've seen in the past few years have come from those film festivals.
Yep.
And I mean, it's you know, it's like, just because you didn't get into Sundance doesn't mean you're not going to get in anywhere. You know,
Yeah.
take the chance to look, really explore, go deep into some of these film festivals. Obviously, obviously do research on them. You don't want to
Yes.
necessarily just submit to anything, because
No.
there,
No.
I know for a fact that there are some that are just not great at all, and
Right.
sometimes downright corrupt. But
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
you definitely, yeah. But yeah, I mean, you know, even if it's just a small little 2 day film festival, it's like it's not worth. It's still worth taking a chance on to get your work out there.
Exactly. And again, going back to Cassavetes, he had to do that. Those that came after him had to do that. I know Scorsese often talked about his struggles with getting films made, and Cassavetes was a big influence on him, and you could see that especially in the films of Scorsese in the decade of the '70s. I feel like that Cassavetes' influence is very much present, particularly Mean Streets.
Yeah.
It's funny watching Shadows and Faces. I kept thinking, wow, Mean Streets reminds me a lot of these two movies because there is that sort of same style. And Mean Streets, that was not. I mean, it's considered a masterpiece now, but back then he had a hard time getting that film out there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, Going back to Cassavetes and talking about faces, like I already said, you can tell immediately that this movie just feels very different and very much
Yes.
he's so much grown as a filmmaker in the decade since Shadows.
Hmm.
And the thing that I really loved about Faces is that this movie's episodic. Faces is episodic as well,
Yes.
but it's because of but that's only because of the fact that he builds up these long extended scenes that
Yep.
almost could play as short films in their own right. Like
Oh yeah.
you could take some of these scenes and just take them out of the film and put them on their own, and they would work as a short film.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about Faces, as well as A
Yes.
Woman Under the Influence. There are like two sequences in particular in Woman Under the Influence that are probably some of the best short films you'll ever watch.
Absolutely. And I know exactly what scenes you're talking about, but yes. And that's the extraordinary thing about that I liked about Faces, probably more so than Shadows, is that it was more plot driven, but yet it still retained that improvisatory
Yeah,
element to it, and it also retained that sort of cinema verite style filmmaking. But no, but you're absolutely right. Particularly the dancing scene towards like the last quarter of the film,
mm,
like that scene, and also when I'm drawing a blank now. There's scenes very much like the dancing scene where the characters sort of meander around, but I felt like this time Cassavetes had more of a through line going on in this film, if that
yeah,
makes sense. Um, like the opening scene with Richard and Jean, and I forget the other character's name that's with them, but they're just drinking and they're just laughing the
yeah,
whole time. It's great. Then when he goes home to his wife Maria, and they're laughing through argument, and it's great. They're sitting at the table. He's having his dinner. He's drinking a beer. She's sitting across the table on the other side, and they're just laughing as they're arguing. And it was some of the best acting I've seen across these films.
yeah. The thing about Faces is that is so extraordinary is that, and really it's kind of the same thing with Women Under the Influence, but in a very different way.
Hmm.
Faces is essentially about the deterioration of a marriage.
Yes.
And but the thing is you don't necessarily get a clear idea of why either one is genuinely unhappy in their marriage
Yep.
until the husband, played by John Marley, simply
Hmm.
tells her at that dinner table,
Hmm.
I want to get a divorce,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
sends her off on her own journey. And I love the fact that there's this journey that both of these characters have apart from each other after that moment. And it's just only in a few scenes. It's like him going back to Jenna Rollins, and and then her with Seymour Castle's character and her almost ODing. And the thing is, it's like then they come back, and then they come back together, and to a certain extent you can see a bit of regret on either face,
Hmm.
but at the same time you can also tell that things are probably broken forever between them,
Yeah. Hmm.
not just because of what they've done but because of what's been revealed by you know that they you feel like their true feelings have been made known for probably the first time in their marriage.
Without a doubt. Without
And
a doubt.
I love the fact that she ends up staying up to him in a way that is very much kind of the opposite, where he felt you felt like he was being her down at that dinner scene
Mhm.
earlier.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, no, I love that element of it, and as well as a- and again, there's a few things going on here that sort of are thematic throughout these three films. For one thing, jazz, especially Shadows and Faces, jazz plays a huge role, not just in the soundtrack, but also in the music that's within the frame of the
Yeah.
shot. You know, whether a character's listening to music or dancing to music,
Hmm.
and very much the way the films are made, they're very jazz-like. You know, so it almost makes sense how jazz is sort of going is sort of a through line between those two films. And even the endings of all three of these films, they don't have a clear-cut ending. They're very much open. You're not really sure what's going to happen to the characters. The destination's unknown. I love that about these films, is
Yeah.
that you were sort of left to sort of imagine, okay, what's going to happen now with these characters, particularly the end of Faces, because you're not exactly sure what happens with this marriage. Are they going to continue? Are they going to keep it going? Or are they going to go their separate ways? Stay married and have their affairs on the side? Like, I mean, who knows? We don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I mean, even in Shadows you kind of get that too. I mean, you get the fact that she's in a happier place with the relationship that she's in now. But
Right.
is she really going
Right.
to, is that something that's going to be a long lasting thing?
Hmm.
With Faces, I can, like you said, I mean, are they going to stay together and just kind of, just stay together for this simple fact of staying together and just kind of live out their truths to themselves? Or
Hmm.
are they going to just kind of accept the fact that this is not for them and go on? Because you don't necessarily feel like either of the relationships they go into with Jenna Roland's character for him and with Seymour Castle's character for her are
Right.
permanent. They're basically just trysts, essentially.
They are. They are. Yeah. And and ultimately it's a film not just about marriage or relationships. It's also a film about aging, really. 'Cause I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in the opening scene, uh um the Frost character, along with his friend, they're reminiscing about a time where they were bachelors, and how they missed those times. So really it's about aging as well, I think, as in addition to a broken relationship or a broken marriage.
Yeah. Well, and I mean that's one of the things that it's one of the things I do find very interesting, at least about Chows and Faces. I mean, Woman Under the Influence is a completely different beast,
Yeah, the whole
but with the first two, you have these men who are in very thinking about things in very, I mean, at the time it would have been very contemporary thinking as far as what it's like to get older as a as a man, of thinking about those times where you were younger, you didn't have the responsibilities that you have, and
Mhm.
feeling like though you and kind of feeling like you needed that freedom and wanted that freedom back. you know
Right.
Now you think about it now, I can't imagine being, I dread the idea of being, being where I was in like my 20s. I was messed
Yeah.
up in my 20s. I would be miserable now if I was still in the same place I was in my 20s.
Right.
But
Right.
at the same time though, it's like, but and then with the women, it's almost like there's this awakening to possibilities beyond like what society kind of expects from us with
Mhm.
with the women in both of these films.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and we should also preface by saying that Gina Rollins is John Cassavetes' wife.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, and she played a very intricate role in all his films.
Hmm.
Particularly, I mean, and like she was not in Shadows, but they were still married at the time. But this was like I think this was the first time they really worked together. I could be wrong, but and again, she from there on she played a big role in almost all his films, including Woman Under the Influence, where she gives an outstanding performance in that film.
Yeah. No, we will get to that. There's a ton to talk about with that.
Oh yeah.
Um but yeah, so looks like Jenna Rollins, it looks like the first film she was in of Cassavetes was Childish Wing from 63, which also had
Okay.
Burt Lancaster and Judy Garland in it. Um so yeah, that was her first time on screen for
Okay.
Cassavetes. But
That's
like
cool.
you said, I mean they were married, and I mean, the thing that I'll imagine, you have to have a lot of trust on both sides to write some of the material that Cassavetes writes uh for Rollins here. Like, you have to have a lot of trust in her to be able to perform it, and she has to have a lot of trust in him to play some of this stuff. Because I mean, she's essentially a hooker in Faces.
Right.
She's
Yeah.
essentially a hooker in Faces, and
Right.
in Woman Under the Influence, she's, well, we can get to that, but yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of really lot of really tough material for her to play in that movie, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, we'll go ahead and dive into it. 1974's Woman Under the Influence,
Mhm.
and Jenna Rollins plays a housewife and a mother, Mabel, who
Mhm.
is coming undone. I mean, that's kind of a common theme between all of these. You kind of feel like something is coming undone in all three of these movies. And I mean, Faces, it's a marriage. In Woman Under the Influence, it's Mabel. And
Yeah.
we don't. One of the things that I really love about this movie is that we never really figure out why. What is it that's causing her to feel this way? Is it something that's just that she just her brain is not wired properly? Is it alcohol? I mean, we kind of get the impression that it could be alcohol because I mean, she drinks at this party she's hosting for the kids, but also her mother-in-law at her homecoming is like, yeah, we don't really want alcohol here while she's coming back. So it's like we never really get a sense of what is
No.
causing her to act out the way that she is.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge part of the reason this movie is so impactful.
Yep. Without a doubt. It's funny you mentioned the why. Uh, in all three of these films, we really don't know the why of a lot of these situations, and in some ways, that's okay
Yeah.
because you're so immersed that it almost doesn't matter. It's particularly in this case, and Peter Falk plays the husband,
Mm-hmm.
and Nick, and he's fantastic as per usual. And he actually put money into this picture. I think I read somewhere he put about $500,000
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
doing Columbia, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and and like you said, Cassavetes mortgaged his home, and this was originally going to be a play. But Gina Rollins, she read the script and loved it, but didn't feel she could do that for 8 nights in a row,
Yeah.
and that's when Cassavetes decided to commit it to film, and uh, it's a very different film from the previous two because, again, like I said, the photography is very different compared to the other two. It does have some touches of that cinema verite style, but for the most part, the camera's further away,
Yeah.
longer lens. It's more voyeuristic, which is
Mm-hmm.
appropriate, which is almost appropriate, almost like we're not supposed to be seeing her episodes. We're not supposed to be seeing these private, intimate moments of this broken family, and it works. It works beautifully.
Yeah. I mean, we're just basically watching as things start to deteriorate for
Yeah.
her.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's like you brought up Peter Falk, who's absolutely fantastic. And I love one of the things that I love about this is that you get this moment late in around the middle to late end of the film where he's kind of on his own taking care of the kids. And you kind of see that he in a way he's very lost without her. As much chaos as she's brought to the marriage at this point, he's very lost in terms of how to interact with his kids and how to be a dad just in general. And I mean, it's not something that's hammered home with any degree of like sledgehammer. It's just very subtle. I mean, obviously, I mean, you know, the scene that sequence kind of ends with him, you know, giving one of his kids a sip of beer. So I mean, you know, it's not unsubtle. It's not completely subtle, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like that basically just kind of puts the exclamation point on what we've seen in that like 10 to 15 minute stretch of film.
Right. Oh, well, we also can't forget the spaghetti sequence of
at the beginning. Yeah.
Oh, that's a fantastic sequence because it goes from like nice pleasantries to uncomfortableness to what's going on here. Is he gonna? It's just like it's just such a beautiful escalation. But like you said earlier, you could take that piece out. It could be its own like little short film, and you could get the full story of what's happening, of this deterioration of his marriage, his family. And you know, it's great because, you know, again, it's a sequence. Any other studio or any like the mindset of today's, you know, thoughts on filmmaking, any other studio or I don't know, producer, whomever, they would look at sequences like that and say, yeah, you know, cut this down or cut it out completely because it doesn't advance the story, but it does ultimately.
Well, I mean, going to Scorsese, I mean, you know, the thing is, it's like Warner Brothers when they were test screening Goodfellas, they wanted him to take out the scene with his mother. And that was collectively one of the scenes the test screenings were saying, no, I love that moment. And the thing is, it's like, you can't think of that movie without that moment. And so, I mean, basically, studios at this point don't really know anything about filmmaking. You know, even some of the best ones do. Some of the mini majors, some of the indie studios. I mean, they have a good idea, and they're supportive, but ultimately, the majors at this point they don't know a damn thing about filmmaking.
They don't.
You know, they look at it as a commodity, and it's something that Scorsese has been correct on for decades at this point. So.
Yeah, I mean, the days of United Artists gone. I mean, that was the last. I guess I don't know if United Artists was necessarily a major, but they were up there. They were
major for a while,
for a long time. Yeah. But you know, you know, they were like really, I guess to me anyway, really the last major studio to really think about the artistry of the film. I mean, and you know, there's one certain event which we've covered before that sort of turned that around.
Listen to our discussion on Heaven's Gate, and we'll we expose a bit. We talk a bit more about that, but it's funny, and that was a podcast that you were on.
That's right.
Well, when you brought that to the table because you're such a fan of Cimino, and I mean. It's funny because even the iteration of United Artists that Tom Cruise tried to do in the 2000s, just like what happened to it? It just basically flew by the wayside. I don't even know what happened to it at that point. I mean, that studio basically doesn't exist in any functional form. But I mean, I talked about MGM last year. I mean, that's as indicative of an example as well, because that's bounced from owner to owner over the years, and now that Amazon's got it, it's basically, you know, it's basically a subsidiary of the biggest company in one of the biggest companies in the world now.
Yep, and like, you know, and Disney owns Fox, and you know, Fox, you know, like, so it's all this migration of these big companies and studios merging with an even bigger conglomerate. I mean, that's sort of where we're heading, where all these big studios, they're going to be owned by Apple, Amazon, Disney, all those big companies. That's what's
Yeah.
going to basically, if it hasn't already.
Yeah,
And
basically. Well,
yeah, but
and the thing is, it's like, it's not like, it's not like Fox, it's not like Disney or Amazon are taking on these studios to create, to create new film. I mean, let's be clear, they're doing it to enhance their own reputation and to own franchises that they can exploit. I mean, it's like Amazon basically bought MGM so they can be in the James Bond business and the Rocky and
sure,
Creed business.
sure,
And I
sure.
mean, Disney looks at Fox's stuff or 20th Century Studios stuff, and they see something like, oh yeah, we can use them to furnish, Hulu and stuff like that. I mean,
Hmm.
it's like I said, the majors, they don't care about film. They don't care about filmmaking. But yeah, I mean,
Not it.
going back to Woman Under the Influence, you're absolutely that right. That scene with the spaghetti, and that wasn't necessarily the scene I was referring to, but that is an excellent example of a scene that you could take out of a take out of the movie and basically turn into a short film, and
Yeah.
you'd be mesmerized by it.
Oh yeah.
And you get all the information out of it. No,
Hmm.
the scenes I was thinking of, I was thinking of the scene where uh, Nick brings the doctor in to
Yep.
have her committed,
Yep.
and then her and then her homecoming.
Oh
Those were
yeah.
the scenes I was thinking of, where it's like, but I mean, all of those major scenes, like they all have a very clear beginning, where you understand where things are at the beginning, then you see things escalate, and the
Yep.
way that escalates through editing, through camera work, and like you said, the camera is very static in Woman Under
Yes.
the Influence, but it's always interesting because
Yep.
of what you were looking at and how he frames it. That
Yeah.
is
Even. Oh, good. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, right from the get-go, you noticed that immediately. The colors of the photography, they're so lush
Yeah.
and they're very bright. Um, there it's more, and the lighting is more calculated. It's more stylistic than the previous two. And there's just you could tell from the first few minutes that this is a filmmaker working at the top of his form at this
Mhm.
point in time in his career, without a doubt.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is even, the leap that I talked about when it comes to shadows and faces. I mean, this is almost, I mean, I don't know if it's quite as substantial a leap in
Right.
technical qualities, but it really is. And
Yes.
I mean, the fact that he shoots in color, and you mentioned the colors, and one of the things that it's funny because of the fact that I was thinking about watching it. And it's like, I don't know. It felt, to a certain extent, it felt like maybe one of the first real indictments of the suburbs and suburban life, because of the fact that you get the idea that they are in the suburbs. They're
Yeah.
middle class people. They're middle class family. I mean, he works for the
Sure.
city.
Yeah.
But she's able to stay at home and raise the kids. But I mean, they have kids over from the neighborhood and stuff like that. So I mean,
Hmm.
is suburban life what's causing her to act out this way? It could be. You can certainly make a read on that. You can
Yeah.
certainly make a read on the fact that, one of the first things that happens is Nick has to break off a date uh with Mabel, because
Yeah.
of the fact that he's got to work late. And
Yeah.
you can tell that they'd been planning it, that his mother took the kids to her place for the night, and then they
Right.
come back the next day, and we see how that unfolds. But even when he comes home, he's coming home, and he's like, we've heard him say, it's like, oh, I'm not gonna be coming in, and it's like, I'm gonna spend the day with my wife. Well, he brings his entire crew over, and
Yeah.
that's where the spaghetti scene happens.
Right,
And
right.
so it's like, in a way, in a way, that scene plays like her reacting to him,
Yep.
taking this time that they were supposed to have together and basically making about other people. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's another turn of the screw. And
Yes.
again, there's so many, it's such a brilliant script. It's such a brilliant, each scene escalates everything else up
Mm-hmm.
until that moment where she's finally committed.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get
Yeah.
a bit of a downturn where we see what it's like with him on his
Mhm.
own.
Right.
And then you get this idea that, he can't necessarily handle this. He isn't as familiar with his kids as he needs to be.
Right.
He can't
Yeah.
be a dad on his own.
Right.
And then when we see her return, it's just such a it's such that is such a brilliant slow burn where it's like you can feel like she's kind of normal, but at the same time she's not, because she's completely
Yes.
abnormal compared to how we saw her at the beginning.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No. She when she arrives back home, she's a lot more apprehensive. She's very calculated. Then he takes her aside and is like, no. He's like, no. He's like, no. He's like, no. Give me. He's like, give me. He's like, be yourself. Be yourself. And then she comes out, and slowly the escalation just builds up and builds up and
Yeah.
builds up, and she's without giving too much away, it comes to a very disturbing conclusion. I'll
Yeah,
say
it
that.
does. It does. And but the thing is, it's like one of the things that is, you talked about the fact that all three of these endings are kind of open to interpretation, and I do
Yeah.
agree to a certain extent, but I think one of the things that is so striking about Woman Under the Influence is the fact that it does kind of feel like at the end there's this understanding, there's silent understanding between the two of them
Mhm.
that they're probably better together
Right.
than they would be apart. Not just
Yes.
as a couple, but as parents to their
Yep.
kids.
Mhm.
And maybe going forward, we're going to see a change in the way things go. But at the same time, you're not sure because, like you said, it climaxes, that moment climaxes at such an unsettling place
Yeah.
because of what it implies, because of what it seems like she might feel like she needs to do.
Yep.
And it does still feel like there's a lot of things that are going unsaid.
Hmm. Oh yeah, without a doubt. And again, going back to some of the other long extended scenes of the beer scene, for example, that was I got kind of a kick out of that because I was like, wow, that seems like a very Peter Falk thing he
Yeah.
would do. And, but I mean, and then you kind of look at that scene like in a serious way, and you kind of wonder, okay, him doing that, she's not around. What so it's like who is the more substantial parent here, lack of a better word, because I mean, when she's around, her tendencies tend to leave the kids a bit apprehensive. When he's on his own, he's giving them beer, and
Yeah.
so it's like, okay, it's a which of the two evils here is really better for the children, and it's like it's a very fascinating study on parenting, I guess, and about marriage, so it's really fascinating, and of course the birthday party scene as
Yeah.
well, and the father the Jensen, I think his name is. He comes over with his kids, and he's not sure if he wants to leave them there.
Yeah.
And and by the way, I knew that actor looked very familiar, and surely enough, he was in Raging Bull. He was one of the cornermen.
Oh,
Mario
okay.
Mario Gallo was his name.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
there's one pivotal scene in Raging Bull where Jake LaMotta throws a fight with Ben Foster. They're in the locker room, and this trainer is and the same actor, Mario Gallo, as the trainer. He says to him, forget about fighting. Just stop fighting. And he starts crying for Jake LaMotta.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I knew he looked familiar. So that was a cool little bridge there between Cassavetes and Scorsese.
Hmm. Well, I mean, and that is the thing about Scorsese, is that he would take people and people who had worked with people who inspired him, if he could,
Yeah. Yeah.
and put them in his own work. And that's one of the things that I love about. I mean, you see the same thing when Truffaut shows up in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I
Exactly.
mean, you see that these filmmakers who grew up on film and would become phenomenal filmmakers in their own right, they
Exactly.
would take their inspirations and pay homage to them in very direct ways.
Oh
And
yeah.
I mean, even and even Lucas, it's like one of the things that you see that's interesting about Star Wars and THX 1138 and Rares of the Lost Ark is that he's taking off of he's riffing on the genres that inspired him, off of the ideas that inspired him, and that's one of the things that we don't get as much anymore. I mean, they're phenomenal filmmakers out now. There's some truly exciting filmmakers out now, but
Yeah.
you don't necessarily, but you feel like they're coming from it to a certain extent. There's some that are trying to pay tribute to filmmakers very directly, but
Yeah.
not in a way that's nearly as interesting as what we saw out of
Sure.
Scorsese, Spielberg, and Lucas, and all those filmmakers.
It's so true. And one note about Spielberg, actually, which I actually didn't know this. I guess apparently he was an unpaid runner or volunteer on Shadows.
Oh
Like
yeah,
he would
that's
like,
right. That's
yeah.
right.
So I thought that
Actually, I think it was Faces.
faces, right?
Yeah, it
Okay,
was
yeah,
Faces because that was the one. Because Shadows was in New York
yeah,
and Faces was in L.A. But yeah, I did remember reading that. Yeah,
yeah. I thought that was very fascinating to know that fact. But yeah, just a random tidbit that I
yeah.
remembered.
No, you're
But
absolutely right. I forgot about that.
yeah, no, it's great. I have to say again how amazing Gina Rollins is in Woman Under the Influence. I just could not get over. She was incredible, and correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't she get nominated for an Oscar, or did she
She
won
did.
one?
Yeah, I think she got nominated for she got nominated for actress and I think Cassavetes got nominated for directing. Is either
Yeah, that
yeah, because I think he got nominated for writing for Faces, but was
yes.
directing for Woman Under the Influence. But yeah, no, I mean it's truly one of the best performances. It's probably one of the best performances I've ever seen, and
Oh,
it's
likewise.
one of those things where it's like that performance is so interesting because of the fact that one of the things that I wrote down as I was as I was taking notes about when I watched it this morning, and one of the things I'm pointing out in my review about the movie is that I love there are moments where that what we're seeing Falk and Rollins do, it doesn't feel very natural to the way humans interact,
Yeah.
but it feels very authentic to
Hmm.
those characters.
Hmm.
And that's where we get our empathy for those characters from. And it's just because I mean, if Falk, if Nick was a real person treating his wife that way, you would like there are times where you would wonder, is he an abuser? Like, but
Yeah.
at the same time, you see and I mean, because of the fact that we've followed them and have seen them in their own intimate moments, we see that basically when he's hitting her at times, he's doing so to try to handle the situation as best he can.
Right.
He's trying
Right.
to he's trying to handle the situation that she's in. She to try to calm her down in a way, but it
Right.
really just only builds things further.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's one of the fascinating things is that you see him do that, and you ask yourself as a viewer that is this justified? Is it, and like it's sort of a challenging, weird question that you get because obviously it's poor behavior.
Yeah,
It's abusive behavior, but at the same time you wonder, is that the only way he could handle her? Is that the only way he can get her to calm down? I mean, you would hope not, but yeah, like you said, you develop so much empathy because there is that abusive behavior going on, but yet you wonder what you wonder how else Nick can bring his wife back down to earth. And it's very sad situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean there are also times where you look at Mabel and you wonder how much of this is her acting out too, especially in
Yeah,
that scene at the
yeah,
beginning with the spaghetti.
yeah.
Like you certainly use by the time the climax of the movie comes, you definitely feel a bit differently in terms of where her that her issues are probably considerably deeper than even we understand or
Yeah.
even they understand at this point.
Yeah, because I mean, it's implied that she does have a drinking problem, but we don't really see her drink that much. Oddly
No.
enough, so you have to wonder, okay, is this behavioral for sure? Is this a condition? Is this from alcohol? Is this something else we're not seeing? Is this just her uh being this way to get attention? To get attention? I hate saying that, but I mean, is it that? Is it? We have no idea, and that's kind of the beauty of it. Is you're sort of taking on this interesting journey where you're sort of learning with her and with Nick as to what exactly is going on. Because
Yeah.
because I mean, really, we don't know. We really don't
Mhm.
know.
No. This was such a phenomenal watch. I'm still on a high about it because of the fact that I did end up watching it today
Same.
before the podcast, and it's
Yeah.
like it's just such a it was such a riveting experience. I knew this is one that I've had on my list for a while, even more in Shadows and Faces. I
Right.
mean, so it's like, oh, I want now that we're talking Cassavetes, so it's like, okay, we'll I'm gonna finally watch this, and boy, did it not disappoint me. I mean, none of these really disappointed. I mean, and
Now.
I love that, like I said, I mean, I just love the fact that it's like you can see this evolution of him as a filmmaker and this
Yeah.
growth of him as a filmmaker and as a storyteller too. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that he's not afraid to have us come to our own conclusions about what's going on.
Right. Exactly. No, and it makes you appreciate him as a filmmaker, and really, it makes you want to see more of what he had to offer. I mean, opening night, Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Uh, um, um, I'm just naming random films of his. Minnie and Mankiewicz. There's just was so many that he's. Oh, Love Streams.
Yeah.
As well, which all enough was produced by Canon Films, who are not really known for their artistry.
No, but like A's all over talked about when they talked about love streams. It's like it's one of those things where it's like what Canon probably thought, hey, you know what, we'll throw some money at Cassavetes, maybe we'll get some Oscar buzz off of it.
Yeah,
And then you had Gloria as well,
yeah,
in the
Gloria.
early '80s, which Jenna Rollins was also nominated for an Oscar for.
Right?
And did you ever see the Sharon Stone version of that?
No, I haven't.
It's I mean it's it's okay, but I can't remember if I've you know what, I might have seen that film from Cassavetes just because
Yeah.
I'd seen the Sharon Stone one, so it's like, oh, I want to see the original
Of
version,
course.
but I can't remember if I really had.
Yeah.
um
Yep.
but yeah, no, his work, it does make me want to dive in a bit more about Cassavetes' work. And he's somebody who he's also somebody who would take acting jobs to get money to make his films.
Yep.
And it's really, even in the 70s and 80s, where it's like the 70s are held up as this bastion of creativity for filmmakers, for mainstream filmmakers, even in the birth of the film school generation of
Yeah.
Hollywood. But at
Mhm.
the same time, even in the 70s, Cassavetes is having to do stuff to get his movies made. And it's like, how's that happen for a filmmaker? But I mean, I do think to a certain extent, I mean, you look at his work in these three films and you can kind of get it because of the fact that his films are still very much his films are still very challenging as far as how they approach things structurally.
Are. Yep. Yep. There's no clear cut structure. And again, he's working in a form that's reminiscent of French New Wave. But, like I kept thinking of 400 Blows as I was watching
Yeah.
Shadows and Faces. Because that film also works with a sort of loose, not that it was improvised, but a very sort of loose style. Not so much a structural film, 400 Blows, but again, that was sort of true full stop. Same with Godard, Breathless, obviously, very loose in its execution, very improvisatory as well. So he's working in that form, which was not exactly welcomed in America early on, and then it took a while before it became embraced. And again, going back to Woman Under the Influence, like I said earlier, he was taking reels of film theater to theater just to exhibit the movie because no one wanted to distribute it.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, it's he passed away in 1989, and it's like he's somebody who I can see if he had been working now, I can see maybe getting like IFC or Neon or some of those film studios behind him.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, in the 70s and 80s, it's like, yeah, it was 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, yeah, he's still a bit avant garde, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, he paved the way for the independent boom that would come in the late 80s, and then the 90s would just have the explosion.
I mean, and even in the early '90s, as I was watching Shadows, I also kept being reminded of, or I should say, the other way around. Clerks
Yeah.
kind of has the same loose style as Shadows, Faces, all of that. So that influence, it goes down the line more than people probably realize. Because I mean, it's funny because it's like new filmmakers, they'll look at a filmmaker today, they'll look at it like a famous filmmaker. Let's say, I don't know, I'll say Kevin Smith, for example. He'll say, "Oh, I was influenced by so and so. That person was influenced by somebody else," and there's a whole chain
Oh yeah.
of influences like through the years. I'm sure a filmmaker that's working today, I can't think of one on the top of my head, but I'm sure someone out there was influenced by Scorsese. Scorsese was influenced by Cassavetes. He was influenced by whomever.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to get this sort of chain of film history where the generational influence goes from one to the next, and then you develop a love for cinema of yesteryear. And I think that's important, especially if you're a filmmaker or a film critic.
And this is one of my favorite subjects, and something that I wrote about a couple of years ago during one of the Scorsese Marvel wars that were taking place. And one of the things that we both have a shared admiration and love of Scorsese. I mean, I'm at the altar of his documentaries on American and Italian cinema.
Sure.
That's well known by now.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that I love about those is that it really taught me one of the most important lessons in terms of watching films, which is how do films lead you in the direction of other films? I mean, granted, this happened even before I watched those documentaries. I was kind of doing it because of the fact that, I mean, one of my more formative experiences was The Crow. The Crow led me to follow Alex Proyas going forward, led me to watching Brandon Lee's films before he passed away. But, and I think we talked about it in the Tarkovsky discussion. There was one blurb in one review of The Crow that mentioned Stalker by Tarkovsky. That led me to eventually find that movie, and that led me to Tarkovsky. And like you said, I mean, that's one of the things that's really kind of frustrating about a lot of film culture right now is that it doesn't feel like people want to get out of their particular lanes of film watching. Like they fall in love with a particular type of film, that's all they'll watch. And you know what? More power to you. That's fine. There's
Absolutely.
nothing wrong with that because there's no one way to be a film lover. There really
No.
isn't. But if you're somebody who's more exploratory of the genre of the medium, take those opportunities, watch a Scorsese film, read about some of his influences, take in those influences.
Right.
If and that's one of the things that I wrote about in a couple of years ago, where it's like, how much different would film culture be if some of these people who love Marvel movies
Hmm.
and love, say, Black Panther,
Hmm.
and instead of just really appreciating what Black Panther did to the MCU, maybe they check out Ryan Coogler's earlier film. If
Yeah.
they love Doctor Strange 2 or the Spider-Man trilogy with Tobey Maguire,
Hmm.
check out some of Sam Raimi's earlier work.
Oh
And
yeah.
that will take you into a completely different view and might take you to the Coen brothers and to all sorts of different areas.
Yep. Yep. Well, yeah. I mean, I get, and like you just reminded me too. Like, you watch like Lord of the Rings. Let's say, look at Peter Jackson's earlier movies. I mean, very vastly different than the epic scale films that he ended up making. And,
No, and it's funny because of the fact that even movies like the movies immediately preceding that in his filmography, Heavenly Creatures and The Frighteners,
yep. Uh-huh.
vastly different from that.
Vastly
I mean,
different.
granted,
Yes.
not as wildly different as Meet the Feebles and Bad Taste,
Right.
but still a completely different side of Peter Jackson that you wouldn't see afterward. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just absolutely, I think the thing that both of us are getting at, and one of the reasons that this, I'm so glad we had this discussion, and this made me miss the past few years of really talking to you even more,
Yeah.
is the fact that it's like, what we're talking about here is expanding the love of films that you have. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I want to do on this podcast, I'm not just doing this podcast for myself to hear myself think. I
Hmm.
love talking about subjects, especially subjects I'm not as familiar with, like Cassavetes. Like,
Yeah.
I'd never seen any of these films before. So
Hmm.
I'm going to take the opportunity to watch these films for this podcast.
Yeah. Hmm.
When I discussed Barbara Stanwyck a couple months ago, I
Hmm.
hadn't seen 3 of those films before. I
Hmm.
hadn't seen. There are a ton of films I had not seen before that I've watched for this podcast because I'm curious,
Hmm.
and that's why I love. That's why I love that the format of this show has essentially become about film history
Yeah.
and how to. This is a big part of how I explore film history. There are
Hmm.
plain places that are talking about mainstream movies, that are talking about contemporary films, and we will
Sure.
do that, and I'll do that every once in a while.
Sure.
I want to talk about films that matter to me, first of all, but also to my guests. And also, I
Hmm.
want to discover new films too.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, and that's not to say contemporary films don't have a place. They absolutely do, and there's a reason that they exist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if you go to the yesteryear of cinema, the films that are out now, they had to come from somewhere. I mean, the medium, it, it just always evolved. I mean, but the ultimate process is the same. You have a recording device and you have actors in front of the camera and you record that. I mean, that has not changed. What has changed though is how movies are made. I mean, so really nothing has changed with cinema except how we make movies today. But if you take, say, a Marvel movie, you look at that director's work, we'll go back a little bit further, then you realize, oh, they were influenced by so and so. So it's not necessarily as cold, I don't think, as it's made out to be. There's a reason that movies are made the way they are today. It had to come from somewhere, ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like that. That's the value of a filmmaker like Scorsese, and
Yep.
value of that's a big part of why I love those documentaries, is because of the fact that he goes through film history. It's he's like the favorite film professor you could ever have,
Oh
because
yeah, yeah.
his depth of knowledge is extraordinary, and the
Yep.
way he talks about it is passionate. And
Yeah.
that's the thing that you need in order to really study film.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at the shelf behind me, I don't know if viewers are going to see the video of this, but I mean, on my top shelf, I have a Hitchcock box set, Superman, and Police Academy. Vastly different, but they all have an evolution. They all have some sort of background. I mean, I remember listening. This is so random, but I remember listening to the on the DVD of Police Academy 6. The director of it talked about his Hitchcock influences that he put into the movie. The director of Police Academy 6. I mean, come on, it's not a good movie, but but there's an influence there as well. You know, he thought
Yeah.
it's there's a specific shot in Police Academy 6 that he took from Saboteur, one of Hitchcock's great movies.
Mm-hmm.
So even something as cynical as Police Academy 6, there's I don't want to say artistry, but there is an influence there that so I guess what we're getting at is you could take the most cynical cash grab movie, and surely enough, if the director has some inkling of something in them, there's something there going back. Richard Donner, even with Superman 1, great filmmaker. He was amazing. He did more than just, than just stuff like that. He was a
Yeah.
fantastic filmmaker, you know.
One of my absolute favorites. I mean, I love Donner. It's like I actually watched his last film recently. I'm gonna be on a I'm gonna be guesting on a podcast discussing it. And oh man, I miss him so much. I miss the films that we didn't get from him in the 15 years before he died. And
Yep.
oh my god, he was so good at what he did.
He was, and I mean, even more on the directors of that series. Again, Richard Lester, another great filmmaker. I mean, before Superman 2, he was in Superman 3. He was doing stuff for the Beatles.
Yeah.
I mean, Sidney J. Fury, who did Superman 4, which arguably is, I shouldn't even say arguably, it's the worst one, but but I mean, there's a filmmaker I follow on Facebook, and his name is going to escape me, and I apologize in advance to this person, but he's working on a documentary about Sidney J. Fury, because he was a true Canadian artist, like film artist, before he got roped into doing Superman 4. So again, there's artistry behind these people, even if the mainstream picture that they're making is not so good. There is a talent, there's an inkling of something behind that, and you got to sort of look for that. And even some of the weaker Scorsese movies, there's an inkling of something there that makes it all the more great. Cassavetes as well. His last picture, Big Trouble, was not well received. I haven't seen it, but I'm curious to see it because it was apparently a studio job. So even Cassavetes, he got roped into a studio picture, one that he did not want to do, but he did it, and it was the last one before he passed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, and your story about listening to the commentary about Police Academy 6 makes me lament the time that films actually had directors' commentaries and those type of extras where you could actually learn this type of information from. The fact that you took that from Police Academy 6 of all things, that's it's like that's just another sign of, it's more of a sign of the fact that it's like the times where studios would really let us be able to appreciate the artist and the craft and what the filmmaker had to say, even in something as ridiculous as that, is gone, and it's unfortunate. We typically have to go to the boutique labels and hope something gets picked up by, Lorber or Shock Factory or Criterion or Arrow to get stuff like that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, most of what I buy for my collection is from those boutique labels, because not only do they treat the films well, the filmmakers themselves also get a chance to even comment on these movies. I mean, there was a release from Kino Lorber of where is it? Oh, Tough Guys with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas.
Okay.
The director of that was Jeff Canoe. Jeff Canoe also did Revenge of the Nerds and True Beverly Hills and a movie with Kathleen Turner where she plays like a spy of V.I. Wachowski,
Oh yes,
something like
yes, I remember that
that.
movie.
Yeah, and then Gotcha. So, and I actually did talk to him too, part of my book, and he doesn't consider himself an artist. He said that time and time again. I'm not an artist. I'm not a film artist. I wish I was, but I'm not. Uh, but there's a thematic element through his films, and they're all about underdogs. And True Beverly Hills, Revenge of the Nerds, and Tough Guys, they're all about the underdog. And he does a commentary on Tough Guys where he talks about working with these great actors, Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster. And I mean, even there, you learn a little bit of something. Even if Tough Guys is not a masterpiece in filmmaking, there's something there. There's something to be said for the film artist behind it.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's like, look, I know that we've spent as much time on this podcast in particular talking about the filmmaking, about film love, about film, about being a film fan, as we have Cassavetes. But honestly, it's like that's one of the things that I love about this conversation because of the fact that, like you said, I mean, he inspired generations of filmmakers after him. And, the fact of the matter is, you can't talk about a lot of these filmmakers, a lot of these major filmmakers, without talking about how they've inspired other filmmakers.
Right.
And, I mean, you can't talk about Kurosawa without
Nope.
talking about how he's inspired basically all of modern American action film.
Oh, yeah.
You can't talk about Truffaut without talking about how he inspired filmmakers like Spielberg when they were looking at their own past about how he was inspired by film noir, how he was inspired by the American films that he watched.
Yeah.
You can't talk about these filmmakers without discussing them within the context of film in general. And I mean,
Absolutely.
the fact that we get to these areas with Cassavetes, I mean, it speaks to Cassavetes. It speaks to what he
Yeah, it
did
does.
as a filmmaker
It does.
that we were able to go here. And I could talk for a few hours more with you on
Same.
this. But I do feel like we have to wrap it up. So, Chris, once again, as always, thank you very much for being on here.
Thank you.
It was so great to talk to you again. And where can people? I mean, I know you talked about what you're working on and where you're working now, but is there places online that people can find you?
Oh, sure. So there is my website predominantly, which has the stuff I've made or stuff I'm working on. That website is storiesmotion.com. I'm also on Facebook under Stories in Motion. That's my production company. Instagram as well. You can find me at Stories in Motion or my name, Chris Esper. Yeah, so that's predominantly where you could find me is those three platforms. But I also have a YouTube channel, a Vimeo channel as well, where I upload all my stuff. And again, Film Threat, I sometimes do some writing for them. So yeah, those are predominantly where you can find me.
And be sure to check out some of Chris's films. He's quite a good storyteller. There's a reason that I've become pretty good friends with him over the years, and there's a reason that I really valued his opinion over the years on this podcast, and why I've wanted to talk to him about so many of the filmmakers that we've talked about. So yeah, be sure to check out his work. And but yeah, Chris, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
I want to thank Chris for joining me on the podcast, for returning to the podcast. It was absolutely a joy to talk to him again. That's going to do it with this episode of the Sonic Cinema podcast. We got plenty more coming up on the podcast this summer. We got more filmmakers to talk about. We got a living legend as far as a composer. We've got genre to explore with one of my favorite individuals to talk to about movies, even if he doesn't necessarily isn't quite sure what to think about my taste. But anyway, that's going to do it with this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. As I said before, check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Check us out at wherever you listen to stuff, podcasts, as well as my reviews at www.sonic-cinema.com.